While I was pregnant, I got a call from a police officer. "Your husband is in the hospital," he said. "We found him with another woman." When I got there, the emergency room doctor looked at me with deep pity and said, "What you are about to see may shock you." He pulled back the white privacy curtain, and I collapsed the moment I saw who it was. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who wildly underestimated your worth. My name is Whitney. I am 31 years old, living in Atlanta and working as a senior forensic financial auditor. I thought I had a perfect marriage with my husband Julian, a prominent logistics executive. I was completely and utterly wrong. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed loudly above my head as I gripped the edge of the metal bed frame to keep from hitting the cold linoleum floor. There lay Julian, the handsome, charming man who had kissed my forehead just 4 hours earlier. He had looked me right in the eyes and promised he had a late board meeting to attend. Now he was hooked up to a dozen beeping machines, his head wrapped in thick blood-soaked bandages, completely unresponsive. The rhythmic hiss of his ventilator was the only sound proving he was still alive. But Julian was not the reason my breath caught in my throat. He was not the reason my world stopped turning. In the hospital bed pushed right next to his, with her pale fingers tightly interlaced with my husband's dark hand, was Vanessa. Vanessa is Julian's sister-in-law. She is married to Julian's older brother, Andre. She is a 29-year-old white woman whom my mother-in-law, Shirley, constantly praised for bringing what she called high society class to their prominent African-American family. Vanessa had a few minor scratches on her forehead and a small white bandage wrapped around her wrist. She looked up at me from her hospital pillow. There was no guilt in her eyes. There was no shame, no panic, no regret. Instead, a cold, calculating smirk crept across her lips. She did not let go of Julian's hand. She gripped his fingers even tighter, claiming ownership right in front of my face. I demanded to know what she was doing in my husband's car at 2 a.m. I yelled so loud that a passing nurse stopped in the hallway, her eyes wide with shock. Vanessa simply adjusted her expensive designer blanket, her blonde hair perfectly cascading over her shoulders, completely unfazed by my anger. She told me they were just out grabbing late-night food because she had sudden cravings. Cravings. The word hung in the humid hospital air, heavy-loaded and dripping with an underlying meaning that I was too terrified to immediately process. I chose to ignore her smug face. I turned my attention back to the doctor who had just walked into the trauma bay holding a thick medical clipboard. I squared my shoulders, rubbing my pregnant belly to soothe the sudden kicking of my unborn daughter. I told the doctor I was Julian's wife, and I needed to sign whatever consent forms were required to expedite his emergency surgery. The doctor looked down at his paperwork. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting between my swollen belly and Vanessa's confident face. He cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, and quietly explained that he could not let me sign the forms. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. I raised my voice, reminding him that I was Julian's legal spouse. I told him we had a marriage certificate and that I had the legal right to make decisions for the father of my child. That was when Vanessa let go of Julian's hand. She reached into her expensive leather tote bag resting on the bedside table and pulled out a notarized legal document. She handed it to the doctor with a triumphant, wicked smile. It was a durable power of attorney for healthcare and a comprehensive medical proxy. Julian had secretly signed it 6 months ago. He had legally granted Vanessa full, unquestionable authority over all his medical decisions if he were ever incapacitated. He had deliberately and systematically bypassed his own pregnant wife to give his older brother's wife the power of life and death over him. I felt the sterile rooms spinning around me. I asked the doctor how this was even legally possible without my knowledge or consent. Vanessa cut in, her voice dripping with venom, masked as fake sympathy. She told me Julian knew I was far too emotional and fragile. She claimed Julian wanted to protect me from stressful, heartbreaking decisions because of the baby I was carrying. She said he trusted her logical mind over my erratic hormones. I lunged forward to rip the fraudulent piece of paper from her hands, but the doctor quickly stepped between us. He held up his hands, begging everyone to remain calm. He looked directly into my eyes and delivered the second devastating blow of the night. He stated firmly that the medical staff needed to keep the trauma bay environment completely stress-free because they had 2 pregnant women to worry about. I froze. The blood drained from my face. I looked at the doctor, then slowly turned my gaze back to Vanessa. 2 pregnant women. The doctor explained that Vanessa needed careful monitoring because the severe impact of the crash could have jeopardized her first trimester. He adjusted his chart and stated she was 4 months pregnant. Vanessa locked eyes with me. A wicked, victorious smile spread across her flawless face. My brother-in-law, Andre, worked as an offshore engineer. He had been stationed on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico for the past 7 months. He had not been home a single time since he left. It did not take a forensic auditor to do the basic math. The baby Vanessa was carrying could not possibly belong to her husband. It was Julian's baby. The man bleeding out on the stretcher next to her had been living a twisted double life right under my nose. Before I could even process the horrifying magnitude of this betrayal, the emergency room double doors violently swung open. My mother-in-law Shirley stormed into the trauma bay like a hurricane. Shirley was a 60-year-old woman who wore her perceived high society status like a lethal weapon. She was obsessed with her exclusive Atlanta Country Club memberships, her flawless public appearances, and the prestige of the Caldwell family name within the wealthy Buckhead circles. She had always made it abundantly clear that my working-class background was a permanent stain on their elite lineage. I expected her to run straight to her injured son. I expected her to ask about the well-being of her unborn grandchild, currently resting in my womb. Instead, Shirley marched right up to me, raised her hand, and slapped me across the face with everything she had. The vicious crack echoed off the ceramic tile walls. The metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth. I stumbled backward, clutching my stinging cheek, barely catching my balance against a medical cart. Shirley pointed a perfectly manicured, trembling finger right in my face. She screamed at me, her voice echoing down the hallway, demanding to know what I had done to stress Julian out so much that he had to go for a desperate midnight drive to blow off steam and end up in a nearly fatal crash. I stood there absolutely stunned by her sheer audacity. I pointed a shaking finger toward Vanessa, shouting that Julian was sleeping with his own brother's wife and that she was 4 months pregnant with his illicit child. Shirley did not gasp. She did not flinch. She did not look remotely surprised. She looked at me with pure, unfiltered disgust. She told me this family went straight downhill the moment they brought a ghetto orphan like me from the wrong side of Atlanta into their luxurious home. She praised Vanessa right in front of my bleeding face, adjusting her expensive pearls as she spoke. She proudly declared that Vanessa brought real class diversity and elevated social status to the Caldwell name, something my dark skin and blue-collar roots could never achieve in her prejudiced eyes. She told me I should take notes and learn from Vanessa, a woman who actually knew how to take care of her man, instead of burying her head in boring financial spreadsheets all day long. Shirley sneered that my forensic accounting job was a pathetic joke, a blue-collar hustle that brought zero real prestige to their powerful family. She told me I was incredibly lucky Julian even allowed me to carry his last name. The betrayal was absolute, complete, and sickening. My husband was cheating with his sister-in-law. The sister-in-law was carrying his child. And my mother-in-law had known about the affair the entire time and actively supported it because she vastly preferred a white daughter-in-law to parade around her wealthy friends over me. I did not cry. I refused to let a single tear fall. I refused to give Shirley and Vanessa the sick satisfaction of watching me break down in the middle of a hospital. I swallowed the blood pooling in my mouth, stood up completely straight, and smoothed down my maternity dress. I looked Shirley dead in her hateful eyes, turned on my heel, and walked straight out of the trauma bay without saying another word. I marched directly to the main hospital billing department. If they wanted to play sick games with power and control, I would assert my dominance the only way these elitist snobs truly respected. Money. I slammed my hands on the reception counter. I told the billing administrator I wanted to upgrade Julian to the absolute most expensive private VIP recovery suite the hospital had to offer. I demanded an immediate transfer, eager to use our massive joint wealth to take control of his care away from Vanessa. I reached into my purse and pulled out my husband and I's primary joint checking debit card. We had just deposited a massive corporate bonus 2 days prior, bringing the available balance to exactly $150,000. I slapped the card onto the counter, fully prepared to buy my authority. The cashier took the card and ran it through the terminal. She paused, frowned, and swiped it a second time. She looked up at me with a deeply sympathetic frown and slowly handed the card back across the counter. She quietly told me the card was declined. I shook my head, insisting that was a mistake, and demanded she run it as a credit transaction. She shook her head again, her eyes filled with pity, and informed me that the account had completely insufficient funds. My forensic auditor instincts immediately kicked into high gear. This was not a banking error. This was a calculated financial maneuver. My fingers flew across my smartphone screen as I hastily logged into our secure mobile banking app, bypassing the facial recognition to manually enter the emergency PIN. The dashboard loaded, and the primary account balance stared back at me in bold, bright red numbers. $0. The entire $150,000 had been systematically and completely drained. I furiously clicked into the detailed transaction history, my eyes scanning the routing numbers and clearing house codes like I did every single day at my firm. The money had not been withdrawn in cash. It had been wired directly to a masked offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands exactly 2 hours ago. It was initiated right before the screeching tires and the crushing metal of the car crash. My cheating, lying husband had not just betrayed my marriage and started a secret family with his brother's wife. He had meticulously stolen every single dime we had to our name, leaving his pregnant wife completely destitute. But what Julian failed to realize in his arrogant scheme was that he had just challenged a woman whose entire career was built on hunting down hidden assets and destroying financial criminals. He thought he left me with nothing. He had no idea he just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire empire. The drive from the hospital to the Buckhead neighborhood was a blur of neon streetlights and the steady, rhythmic thumping of my own heart. The stinging sensation on my left cheek where Shirley had slapped me was fading, replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity. For 5 years I had played the role they assigned me. The quiet, grateful working-class girl who had supposedly won the lottery when Julian Caldwell proposed. I had smiled politely at their country club dinners while they made passive-aggressive jokes about my public school education. I had spent countless nights meticulously balancing the Caldwell Family Logistics Company books, fixing Julian's sloppy accounting errors to make him look like a corporate genius to the board. I did it because I loved him. Or at least I loved the man I thought he was. But the man lying in that hospital bed, bleeding and broken, was a stranger. I pulled my car into the winding driveway of the sprawling brick mansion Julian and I had shared for the past 3 years. The property was majestic, surrounded by ancient oak trees and manicured hedges that cost more to maintain in a month than my mother used to make in a year. This was supposed to be the home where we raised our daughter. As I stepped out of the car, the crisp night air hit my face. I walked up the marble steps, my hand instinctively resting on my swollen belly. I reached into my purse and pulled out my house key. I slid it into the heavy brass lock on the custom mahogany front door. It did not turn. I jiggled the key, pulling it out and pushing it back in, trying to force the mechanism. It was completely jammed. A sick, heavy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. This was not a jammed lock. The entire locking mechanism was brand new. The polished brass was free of the tiny scratches that had been there just this morning. Before I could even raise my hand to knock, the heavy door swung inward. Standing in the foyer, bathed in the warm glow of our crystal chandelier, was Andre. Julian's older brother looked down at me with the exact same expression of arrogant disdain his mother had worn at the hospital. Andre was 35 years old, but carried the entitled swagger of a teenager who had never worked a hard day in his life. He was dressed in expensive silk loungewear, a stark contrast to the reality that his own trucking division of the family business was hemorrhaging money. Flanking him on either side were two massive private security guards wearing dark suits and earpieces. I stared at Andre, demanding to know what he was doing in my house and why my key was not working. Andre chuckled, a harsh grating sound that echoed in the grand foyer. He leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me to lower my voice because his pregnant wife was upstairs resting. The sheer audacity of his words almost made me laugh. His pregnant wife, the wife who was currently at the hospital clutching his brother's hand, the wife who was carrying a child that Andre proudly believed was his own. I told Andre to step aside because I needed to go upstairs to my bedroom and pack my things. I informed him that Julian was in a horrific accident and I had no time for his childish territorial games. Andre did not move an inch. Instead, he snapped his fingers. One of the security guards reached behind the door and dragged out a battered canvas suitcase. It was the exact same cheap suitcase I had used when I first moved out of my tiny apartment 5 years ago. I had kept it in the attic for sentimental reasons. Andre grabbed the handle and shoved it roughly out the door. It tumbled down the marble steps, landing in the manicured grass. The zipper burst open, spilling a pathetic pile of my oldest t-shirts and maternity leggings onto the lawn. He looked me dead in the eye and told me I did not have a bedroom here anymore. He stated that this mansion was no longer my property. I demanded to know what he was talking about, reminding him that my name was on the mortgage documents we signed 3 years ago. Andre pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and waved it in my face. He gleefully explained that Julian had signed a quitclaim deed entirely removing my name and transferring the total ownership of the property to their mother Shirley just last month. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying precision. The missing funds, the medical proxy, the quitclaim deed. Julian had been meticulously planning to erase me from his life piece by piece, asset by asset. He had systematically stripped me of my finances, my medical rights, and now my home. Andre continued his cruel monologue, completely unaware of the irony of his words. He said Shirley had graciously allowed him and Vanessa to move into the mansion earlier today. He claimed their current house was under renovation, and Vanessa needed a stress-free environment for her delicate pregnancy. He told me Shirley wanted the true Caldwell heir to be born and raised in the family's finest property. I looked at Andre, feeling a strange mixture of absolute disgust and profound pity. He was standing there fiercely defending a mansion he did not buy, protecting a wife who was sleeping with his own brother, and bragging about a child that did not share a single drop of his DNA. He was a pawn in a sick game, playing guard dog for the people who were actively destroying him. I wanted to scream the truth in his face. I wanted to tell him to look at the hotel receipts and the ultrasound dates. But the forensic auditor in me knew that revealing your cards too early was a fatal mistake. You never alert the target until the trap is fully sprung. I bent down as much as my pregnant belly would allow and calmly began gathering my scattered clothes from the damp grass. Andre watched me from the top of the stairs, his lips curled into a cruel sneer. He told me I should pack up and go straight back to the impoverished neighborhood I crawled out of. He said the Caldwell family was finally done playing charity for a low-class gold digger. As I zipped the broken suitcase closed, Andre delivered his final parting shot. He leaned over the railing and told me not to expect any child support when the divorce papers arrived. He said Julian had already confided in the family that he had serious doubts about my fidelity. Andre laughed darkly, stating that knowing my background, nobody would be surprised if the baby I was carrying belonged to some random thug from my old neighborhood. The insult was so vile, so entirely disconnected from reality, that it physically took the breath from my lungs. Julian was projecting his own filthy infidelity onto me to justify his calculated theft. I gripped the handle of my battered suitcase, my knuckles turning white. I did not yell. I did not curse. I looked at Andre, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the smug satisfaction in his eyes. I silently promised myself that within a week I would legally and financially strip him of every single thing that gave him that misplaced arrogance. I turned and walked back to my car, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind me, locking me out of the life I had spent 5 years building. The moment I sat in the driver's seat, a sudden agonizing pain ripped through my lower abdomen. It was not the dull ache of a standard pregnancy cramp. It was a sharp, breath-stealing contraction that radiated from my lower back all the way down my thighs. I gasped, gripping the leather steering wheel as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the physical assault from Shirley, the shock of the emptied bank account, and the brutal eviction had pushed my body past its absolute breaking point. I was 30 weeks pregnant, and the stress was forcing my body into early labor. I knew I could not go back to the hospital where Julian and Vanessa were. I could not risk running into Shirley or giving them the satisfaction of seeing me in a vulnerable medical crisis. Fighting through the waves of blinding pain, I started the car and drove myself toward my private obstetrician's clinic across town. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road sent a fresh spike of agony radiating through my pelvis. I focused entirely on my breathing, talking softly to my unborn daughter, begging her to hold on, begging her to stay safe inside me just a little longer. I pulled into the clinic parking lot and staggered through the sliding glass doors, clutching my stomach. The waiting room was empty, save for the overnight emergency receptionist sitting behind the glass partition. I leaned heavily against the counter, my breathing shallow and ragged. I told her I was experiencing severe premature contractions and needed to see the on-call doctor immediately. The receptionist, a young woman with a sympathetic face, quickly typed my name into the billing system to pull up my file. I watched her fingers flying across the keyboard. Then I watched her stop. She frowned, clicking her mouse a few times before looking back up at me with profound discomfort. She softly asked if I had a secondary insurance card or a different policy number she could use. I shook my head through a wave of pain, explaining that I was on the premium platinum maternity plan provided by my husband's corporate logistics firm. It was a top-tier plan that covered everything from private delivery suites to specialized neonatal care. I had just used it 2 weeks ago for my routine ultrasound. The receptionist bit her lip, her eyes filled with deep awkwardness. She quietly informed me that the system was showing my specific coverage had been terminated. I squeezed my eyes shut, writing out another agonizing contraction. I asked her how that was possible. She turned her monitor slightly so I could see the screen. She explained that the primary policyholder, Julian Caldwell, had actively logged into the corporate health portal exactly 7 days ago. He had manually unchecked my name from the dependent list and submitted a formal request to cancel all of my premium maternity coverage, effective immediately. He had deliberately stripped away the medical insurance protecting his own unborn child, all while smiling and kissing my forehead every morning. The receptionist handed me a clipboard with a blank financial form. She apologized profusely, stating that because I was now technically uninsured, the clinic policy required a direct out-of-pocket deposit before the emergency doctor could admit me for monitoring and labor suppression protocols. She looked at my swollen belly with genuine pity and told me the required cash deposit was $5,000. $5,000. My joint bank account held exactly zero. My house had been stolen. My husband was a monster. My in-laws were ruthless predators who wanted me destroyed. A normal woman would have broken down right there in the clinic lobby. A normal woman would have fallen to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, begging for mercy from a world that had suddenly turned incredibly cruel. But I did not cry. My tears had dried up the moment I saw that offshore wire transfer on my laptop screen. The sheer calculated malice of Julian's actions completely eradicated any remaining trace of the loving wife I used to be. The only thing left in my chest was the cold, calculating precision of a woman who destroyed financial criminals for a living. I stood up straight, ignoring the burning pain in my abdomen. I reached into the hidden lining of my purse and bypassed my empty joint debit cards. Instead, I opened a secure encrypted folder on my phone, requiring a 12-tier alphanumeric password and a biometric scan. I retrieved a sleek, heavy, solid black titanium card. It did not have the name Whitney Caldwell printed on the front. It did not have any name on it at all. It simply bore the anonymous identification number of a private limited liability corporation that I had established years ago before I ever met Julian. I handed the heavy black metal card to the receptionist. Her eyes widened slightly at the weight of it. She swiped it through the terminal, and the machine instantly chimed with a brilliant green approval. The $5,000 transaction processed in a fraction of a second. She handed me the receipt, her hands shaking slightly as she paged the on-call doctor to come rush me into a private room. I took the receipt and stared at the ink. Julian, Shirley, and Andre genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully outsmarted a naive little bookkeeper from the wrong side of the tracks. They thought my entire existence was dependent on their family's wealth and their corporate crumbs. They had no idea that I never actually needed their money. They did not know that for the past 7 years, my quiet, mundane job was merely a cover. They did not know that I owned an elite independent forensic accounting firm, a firm so highly specialized and ruthless in uncovering corporate fraud that we were exclusively contracted by federal agencies. And the greatest irony of all, the secret that made a cold, lethal smile spread across my face, despite the contractions ripping through my body, was that just 48 hours ago, my firm had been retained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Our newest target was a massive logistics empire suspected of laundering millions of dollars through offshore shell companies and illegal federal loan guarantees. The target was the Caldwell Family Corporation. They thought they had just evicted a helpless pregnant woman. They did not realize they had just declared war on the federal auditor who already held the keys to their entire destruction. I drove straight to the heart of the city, where the glass and steel skyscrapers touched the clouds. I did not go to a cheap motel or a friend's house. I parked in the secure underground garage of a luxury high-rise building. 2 years ago, I had quietly purchased a sprawling penthouse under the name of an anonymous holding company. It was my sanctuary and my command center, completely disconnected from the Caldwell family and their prying eyes. I stepped out of the private elevator and walked into the massive open-concept living space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, but I ignored the view. I walked straight to my custom-built workspace where 6 curved high-definition monitors sat dormant. I powered up the servers. The hum of the cooling fans filled the silent room. This was my domain. This was where I dismantled corrupt executives and untangled millions of dollars in federal fraud. My cell phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of the desk. I looked down at the glowing screen. Julian was calling. The man who had just evicted his pregnant wife and stolen every penny from our joint accounts was actually calling me. I let it vibrate. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to wait. I needed to compose my breathing. I needed to shift my mindset from a betrayed wife to a federal investigator interrogating a hostile suspect. On the 5th ring, I finally pressed the answer button and brought the phone to my ear without saying a word. Julian's voice came through the speaker. He sounded weak and raspy, perfectly playing the role of a traumatized victim recovering in a hospital bed. He called my name softly, asking if I was there. He breathed heavily into the microphone, telling me how much pain he was in and how terrified he had been during the crash. I kept my voice entirely flat and asked him why Vanessa was in his car at 2 a.m. and why she was holding his hand when I arrived at the emergency room. Julian did not miss a beat. He unleashed a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He chuckled a weak, patronizing sound. He told me I was being overly emotional and letting my pregnancy hormones cloud my rational judgment. He claimed Vanessa had been suffering from severe panic attacks about her own pregnancy. He said Andre was away on the oil rig and Vanessa felt she had no one else to turn to. Julian smoothly explained that she had called him in hysterics, and he was simply acting as a protective brother-in-law, driving her to a private late-night clinic so she would not disturb the rest of the family. He chastised me for making a scene at the hospital and embarrassing him in front of the medical staff. He asked how I could possibly accuse him of infidelity when he was lying in a hospital bed with broken bones. I stared at the blank screens of my monitors. I asked him about the $150,000. I asked him why our joint account had been completely drained exactly 2 hours before his supposed tragic accident. His tone shifted immediately. The fake weakness vanished, replaced by the slick, confident cadence of a corporate executive negotiating a deal. He told me he was protecting our future. He claimed the logistics company was suddenly facing a massive, aggressive tax audit from the federal government. He spun a lie about how corporate accounts were being temporarily frozen, and he had to act fast to protect our personal cash. He said he moved the entire balance into an offshore trust fund specifically created for our unborn daughter, so the government could not seize it. He told me he did it entirely for me and the baby. He acted insulted that I would even question his financial maneuvers when he was the one keeping a roof over my head. Then he sprang the trap. He told me the stress of the audit and the accident was clearly taking a massive toll on our marriage. He said his mother Shirley strongly believed we needed a legal separation just until the baby was born and the dust settled. He kept his voice sickeningly sweet as he laid out his demands. He told me his corporate lawyer would be emailing me a set of divorce papers by the end of the day. He casually mentioned that the family business had a temporary $3 million toxic debt floating on the books. He said he needed me to sign the separation agreement and temporarily accept that $3 million business debt under my personal name. He promised it was just a legal loophole to keep the creditors away from the main corporate accounts during the audit. He swore on his life that he would pay me a massive monthly alimony and quietly take the debt back once the heat died down. He told me to be a good, loyal wife and sign the papers so we could put all this ugliness behind us. He was asking me to legally bind myself to $3 million of his fraudulent corporate debt while handing over all my marital rights. He wanted to bury me under a financial avalanche so massive I would never be able to afford a lawyer to fight him. He wanted me penniless, drowning in debt, and entirely dependent on the fake alimony he would inevitably stop paying the moment the divorce was finalized. I did not scream at him. I did not tell him I knew about the medical proxy or the canceled health insurance. I certainly did not tell him that the federal government was indeed auditing his company because my firm was the one conducting the investigation. I simply breathed into the receiver and told him to send the papers to my email. I told him I needed to rest. I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I needed him to believe his gaslighting had worked perfectly. I needed him comfortable and arrogant. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone chimed with a new notification. It was a message from Shirley. It contained a large video file and an audio voice note. I clicked the audio file first. Shirley's voice poured through the speakers, dripping with aristocratic venom and racial prejudice. She did not ask about my health or the agonizing contractions I had suffered at the clinic. She told me she hoped the cold reality of the streets had finally reminded me of my proper place in the social hierarchy. She said she was currently looking at the family she was always destined to have. She praised Vanessa with sickening adoration. She explicitly stated that Vanessa possessed high society blood and a refined white pedigree that the Caldwell legacy desperately needed to maintain its elite status in Atlanta. Shirley sneered that my dark skin and working-class background were a constant embarrassment to her at the country club. She said Julian deserved a woman who commanded respect in a ball gown, not a miserable little calculator who spent her life staring at boring spreadsheets. She ended the voice note by telling me to stay away from her family and never attempt to contact her prestigious son again. I deleted the voice note and downloaded the video file. I transferred it directly to my main terminal and opened it on my largest central monitor. The video started playing in high definition. It was a recording of a lavish backyard barbecue taking place at the very same Buckhead mansion I had been evicted from just hours ago. The afternoon sun bathed the manicured lawn in a warm, golden glow. The custom outdoor kitchen that I had personally designed and paid for with my previous auditing bonuses was currently being manned by a hired private chef flipping expensive steaks. Sitting in the center of the patio on a plush imported lounger was Vanessa. She was wearing a flowing designer maternity sundress holding a crystal glass filled with a sparkling fruit mocktail. She looked like a pampered queen holding court. Shirley was hovering over her like a devoted servant, offering her plates of fresh fruit and fussing over the angle of the patio umbrella to ensure Vanessa was perfectly shaded. Standing near the grill, holding a pair of tongs and laughing loudly, was Andre. He looked completely oblivious to the fact that his mother and his brother were openly worshipping his wife. He looked like a foolish, overgrown child playing house while his entire life was being dismantled behind his back. And there, sitting in the shade of the veranda in a heavily padded medical wheelchair, was Julian. His leg was propped up in a thick cast and his arm was in a sling. He looked incredibly relaxed and comfortable for a man who had supposedly been traumatized by a near-fatal collision. He was holding a sleek silver laptop, resting precariously on his thighs, typing away with his good hand while smiling at Vanessa. Any normal woman watching this video would be blinded by tears. Any normal wife would be fixated on the way Vanessa touched her hair and smiled back at Julian. I did not look at Vanessa. I did not care about the sickening display of fake family bonding. My eyes were locked entirely on Julian. I paused the video playback. I opened a highly specialized forensic video enhancement program that my firm utilized for analyzing distorted security footage during federal embezzlement cases. I dragged the paused video frame into the software interface. I isolated the specific section of the image containing Julian's face. I zoomed past his arrogant smile and his perfectly groomed beard. I focused entirely on the dark reflective lenses of his expensive designer aviator sunglasses. I applied a series of complex stabilization filters to reduce the environmental glare reflecting off the curved glass of his sunglasses. I adjusted the contrast, enhanced the pixel density, and sharpened the specific area reflecting the light from the laptop screen resting on his lap. The software processed the rendering for a few heavy seconds, the cooling fans on my servers spinning louder. Then the image snapped into crystal clear focus on my monitor. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. I was looking at a reversed but perfectly legible reflection of Julian's laptop screen. He was not checking his email. He was not reviewing harmless corporate logistics reports. He was logged into an encrypted financial portal. I recognized the interface immediately. It was the specific routing dashboard for a notorious offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. I could clearly see the transaction confirmation screen, the heavily disguised routing columns, and the exact account digits he had just transferred our stolen money into. Julian was actively moving millions of dollars in stolen corporate and personal funds right there on the patio. He was doing it right in front of his foolish brother and his hateful mother while smiling at his pregnant mistress. He felt so untouchable, so utterly invincible, that he was committing federal financial crimes at a family barbecue. A slow, cold smile stretched across my face. Julian and Shirley genuinely believed I was sitting in some cheap motel room crying over a broken marriage and an empty bank account. They thought I was a fragile, pregnant victim paralyzed by their cruelty and intimidated by their fake high society power. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting inside a multi-million-dollar command center, armed with federal auditing software, watching their every single move. They wanted me to hold a $3 million debt. They wanted to erase me from their elite world. I cracked my knuckles and pulled up the federal banking database on my second monitor. I was not just going to erase them. I was going to surgically map every single dirty dollar they had ever touched and burn their entire empire to ash. My fingers flew across the backlit keyboard of my primary terminal. The Caldwell Family Logistics Corporation utilized a commercial enterprise resource planning software that I was intimately familiar with. Julian always boasted about their impenetrable corporate firewall, but he had severely underestimated the capabilities of a federally sanctioned forensic auditor. I did not need to hack their system through brute force. I had legitimate backdoor access granted by the Bureau just 48 hours prior. I launched the data extraction protocol and watched as lines of encrypted code cascaded down my secondary monitor. I cross-referenced the Cayman Islands routing number I had isolated from the reflection in Julian's sunglasses. The offshore banking portal required a dual authentication token, but Julian had lazily tethered his corporate email to his private financial applications. It took me exactly 4 minutes to bypass the secondary verification and mirror his active session. I was now standing digitally inside the central nervous system of the Caldwell family empire. I initiated a deep dive into the corporate general ledger, pulling the last 5 years of financial statements. I instructed my software to isolate any anomalous disbursement patterns, specifically focusing on the travel and entertainment expense accounts that Julian managed. I needed to establish a baseline of his deceit before I could dismantle his larger financial crimes. The algorithm returned a massive cluster of flagged transactions categorized under client relations and vendor hospitality. I opened the digital receipts and began cross-referencing the merchant identification codes. The data painted a sickeningly clear picture. Julian had not been entertaining corporate clients. He had been funding a lavish hidden life with Vanessa. I traced a recurring charge to an exclusive boutique hotel in downtown Atlanta. The folios were buried under a shell vendor name, but the itemized room service receipts told the true story. 2 glasses of champagne, couples massage treatments, late-night premium movie rentals. I pulled the geolocation data from his corporate cellular device and matched it against the timestamps on the hotel invoices. They aligned perfectly. Julian and Vanessa had been carrying on an illicit affair for exactly 24 months. Every time Andre was deployed to the oil rig, Vanessa was checking into a luxury suite paid for by the family business, while Julian told me he was working late to secure our financial future. The betrayal was woven into the very fabric of the company balance sheets. I felt a brief, sharp sting in my chest, but I immediately compartmentalized the pain. I was no longer a grieving wife. I was an apex predator hunting my prey through a forest of corrupted data. I pushed the hotel receipts to a secure encrypted folder and dug deeper into the core financial architecture. Julian had mentioned a $3 million toxic debt on his gaslighting phone call, trying to convince me it was a temporary corporate loophole. I knew Julian well enough to know he always minimized his crimes. If he admitted to $3 million, the real number was much higher. I ran a continuous audit trail script designed to flag unauthorized promissory notes and unverified corporate loans. The system churned through thousands of documents before isolating a heavily encrypted subfolder hidden within the accounts payable directory. I cracked the folder and opened the master loan agreement. My blood ran cold as my eyes scanned the digital document. The principal loan amount was not $3 million. It was $4.5 million of high-yield illicit debt sourced from a shadowy private equity group known for predatory lending practices. Julian had leveraged the logistics company's operational assets to secure the cash, but the most horrifying detail was not the amount or the lender. It was the guarantor signature at the bottom of the contract. Right there on the screen, glowing in sharp digital ink, was my electronic signature. Julian had completely bypassed the corporate board and used my identity to underwrite the entire $4.5 million loan. I pulled the metadata attached to the digital signature block. The cryptographic hash revealed the exact date and time the signature was applied. It was a Tuesday night 3 months ago at 2 in the morning. I had been fast asleep in our bed, pregnant and exhausted, while the man lying next to me was using my stolen credentials to sign away my freedom. Julian and Vanessa had orchestrated this massive fraud together. Their plan was diabolical in its simplicity. They would secure the illicit funds, drain the corporate accounts, and prepare to flee. Julian would initiate a sudden divorce, leave me holding the forged $4.5 million debt, and allow the predatory lenders and federal authorities to destroy me. I would be sent to federal prison for massive corporate fraud while they lived out their wealthy fantasy on an offshore island. I stared at the fraudulent signature, my mind racing with cold, calculating fury. I needed to know exactly where that $4.5 million had gone before Julian transferred it to the Cayman Islands. A sum that large could not just sit in a standard corporate checking account without triggering internal compliance alerts. It had to be washed. It had to be layered and integrated through a sophisticated money laundering operation. I ran a sequential tracing algorithm on the loan disbursement funds. I watched the digital money fragment into dozens of smaller wire transfers scattering across multiple regional banks. I followed the money trail as it looped through various shell companies before reconverging in a singular, unexpected location. The funds had been funneled directly into the primary operating account of the Buckhead Community Sanctuary charity. It was an elite philanthropic organization that my mother-in-law Shirley chaired. I pulled the charity's financial records and overlaid them with Shirley's personal banking statements. The hypocrisy was absolutely breathtaking. Shirley, the woman who had slapped me in the hospital and called me a low-class ghetto orphan, was running a massive federal money laundering scheme. She was using her prestigious church charity to wash Julian's stolen millions. I watched the data map out her crimes. Shirley would receive the dirty loan money into the charity account, claiming it as anonymous corporate donations. She would then funnel the cash through a series of fake vendor payments, transferring the clean money directly into her pristine personal retirement accounts. From there, she was quietly wiring the washed funds into the offshore Cayman account Julian had set up. The entire Caldwell family was a syndicate of white-collar criminals, hiding behind designer clothes and country club memberships. Shirley had built her entire elite social standing on the back of stolen money and federal tax evasion. A normal person discovering this magnitude of criminal activity would have immediately picked up the phone and dialed the authorities. They would have handed the encrypted hard drive over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and let the justice system take its slow, bureaucratic course. But the justice system was too clinical. It lacked the theatrical devastation these people truly deserved. They had tried to leave me pregnant, homeless, and facing federal prison. Simply handing them over to the police was not enough. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror and absolute helplessness they had tried to inflict upon me. I wanted them to watch their empire collapse in real time. I opened my proprietary coding terminal and began writing a custom financial routing script. Julian thought he was a genius for moving the money into an offshore account, but he was dealing with basic consumer-level encryption. I bypassed his banking firewalls and gained full administrative access to his Cayman Islands portfolio. The $4.5 million sat there resting safely in the digital vault. I did not freeze the account. I did not return the money to the logistics corporation. Instead, I altered the destination routing code. I located Vanessa's personal offshore banking details, the same account she used to fund her extravagant shopping sprees and hidden hotel rendezvous. I linked her account to the master script. With a few rapid keystrokes, I executed a forced, irrevocable wire transfer. I watched the loading bar flash across my screen as every single penny of the $4.5 million was drained from Julian's hidden vault and dropped squarely into Vanessa's personal name. But I was not finished. The beauty of a forensic trap is ensuring the target cannot possibly escape the fallout. I accessed the internal reporting gateway for the Internal Revenue Service. I embedded a silent automated trigger into Vanessa's new offshore balance. I set the parameter to hold for exactly 7 days. Once the countdown expired, the script would automatically generate a massive red flag alert directly to the Federal Tax Evasion Division, highlighting a massive undeclared international wealth transfer under Vanessa's Social Security number. It was a digital death sentence. I closed the terminal and wiped my digital fingerprints from the server. The trap was set. The timer was ticking. Julian, Vanessa, and Shirley were currently celebrating their victory in my stolen backyard, completely oblivious to the fact that their financial execution had just been scheduled. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up, stretching my aching lower back. The premature contractions had finally subsided, leaving me with a fierce adrenaline-fueled energy. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and bypassed the sensible maternity business suits I usually wore to corporate audits. I reached into the very back and pulled out a stunning, custom-tailored crimson-red maternity dress. It was bold, unapologetic, and demanded absolute attention. It was the kind of dress Shirley always claimed was too aggressive for a proper high-society wife. I slipped it over my shoulders, letting the vibrant red fabric hug the curves of my pregnant body. I paired it with a pair of sharp black stilettos, refusing to diminish my height. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling mirror and looked at my reflection. My dark skin glowed against the vibrant red fabric. My posture was straight, my chin held high. I was not the broken woman they had thrown out into the damp grass. I was the architect of their total destruction. Shirley was hosting her annual high society charity tea party tomorrow afternoon at her exclusive country club. It was her favorite event of the year, a place where she paraded her fake wealth and cemented her status among the Atlanta elite. It was the perfect stage for my first act of retribution. I grabbed my designer handbag and slipped the encrypted tablet containing all their financial sins inside. I was ready to crash the party. The heavy oak doors of the Buckhead Heritage Country Club loomed before me like the gates of a fortress. For 5 years, Shirley had treated this place as her personal kingdom. She had spent countless hours curating her image among the wives of executives and politicians, constantly ensuring they knew she belonged to the highest echelon of Atlanta society. She had always forbidden me from attending her annual charity tea party, claiming my lack of pedigree would somehow taint the pristine atmosphere she worked so hard to cultivate. I handed the keys of my anonymous rental car to the stunned valet, who could not take his eyes off my crimson maternity dress. The fabric was a masterpiece of tailoring, clinging perfectly to my pregnant belly, while flowing dramatically behind me with every step. Around my neck rested a genuine diamond tennis necklace that cost more than the entire catering budget for the event inside. I had purchased it 3 years ago after cracking a massive international embezzlement case for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a piece of jewelry Shirley could only dream of owning, a tangible representation of the immense wealth I had built entirely on my own merit. I smoothed my hands over the red silk, feeling the comforting weight of the encrypted tablet resting inside my designer clutch. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble foyer as I approached the grand ballroom. The two event staff standing at the entrance tried to ask for my invitation, but I simply walked past them, projecting an aura of absolute untouchable authority. The grand ballroom was a sea of pastel floral dresses and wide-brimmed hats. Soft classical music floated down from a string quartet positioned on a raised platform in the corner. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated silently, carrying silver trays laden with expensive champagne and delicate cucumber sandwiches. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral perfumes and the low hum of practiced artificial laughter. I stood at the top of the sweeping staircase overlooking the entire event. The crimson red of my dress acted like a visual siren in the middle of a pastel painting. One by one, heads began to turn. The polite chatter slowly died down, replaced by frantic whispering as the wealthiest women in Atlanta tried to figure out who the striking pregnant woman in the magnificent red gown was. It did not take long for Shirley to notice the disruption. She was standing near the center ice sculpture holding a porcelain teacup and laughing with the wife of a prominent state senator. I watched the exact moment her eyes landed on me. The fake smile froze on her face. The color drained from her perfectly contoured cheeks. She practically dropped her teacup onto a passing tray and marched toward the staircase, her eyes burning with unadulterated fury. I descended the stairs slowly, gracefully, letting her come to me. Shirley stopped at the bottom step, her chest heaving with suppressed rage. She leaned in close so the surrounding women could not hear her venomous tone. She demanded to know how I had gotten past security. She hissed that a bankrupt evicted gold digger had no right to step foot inside her prestigious club. She told me my cheap red dress was an embarrassment and ordered me to turn around and walk out the door before she had me physically thrown into the street. I looked down at her, noting the slight tremor in her hands. She was terrified that I was going to make a scene and ruin her carefully crafted public image. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my calm, collected smile. I simply reached into my clutch and pulled out a certified cashier check. It was printed on thick security paper bearing the logo of my anonymous holding company. I held it up between my index and middle fingers, letting the bright overhead lights catch the embossed numbers. I told Shirley I was not there to cause a scene. I explained that I was simply there to support her wonderful charitable foundation. I raised my voice just enough for the women standing nearby to hear. I announced that I had been so moved by Shirley's dedication to the community that I decided to make a spontaneous contribution to her charity. I handed the check to the senator's wife, who was standing directly behind Shirley, staring at us with wide, curious eyes. The woman looked down at the paper and gasped loudly. She covered her mouth with her hand and read the amount aloud for everyone to hear. $50,000. The entire room fell completely silent. The string quartet seemed to miss a beat. $50,000 was more than the charity had raised in the past 3 years combined. A wave of spontaneous applause broke out across the ballroom. The wealthy wives began clapping and murmuring their approval, looking at me with newfound admiration and respect. Shirley was absolutely trapped. Her eyes darted frantically around the room. She was cornered by her own desperate need for social validation. She could not possibly kick out a woman who had just publicly handed her organization $50,000. Doing so would destroy her reputation and raise countless questions she could not afford to answer. She had to swallow her burning hatred and play along. Shirley forced a stiff, agonizing smile onto her face. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it so hard her manicured nails dug into my skin. She thanked me through gritted teeth, loudly declaring how blessed the Caldwell family was to have such a generous daughter-in-law. I smiled back, leaning in to whisper directly into her ear. I told her the $50,000 was just a small down payment on the absolute hell I was about to unleash on her life. I watched the terror flash in her eyes before I gently pulled my hand from her grip and walked past her into the crowd. For the next hour, I worked the room with the precise, calculated charm of a seasoned corporate auditor. I sipped sparkling water and chatted with the elite wives, dropping subtle, highly specific financial terms that immediately established my dominance. I casually mentioned the offshore tax implications of certain luxury real estate investments, watching as several women looked at me with deep respect. They thought I was just Julian's quiet little wife. But now they saw a powerful, independent woman dripping in real diamonds and casually tossing around massive charitable donations. I was completely rewriting my own narrative right in front of Shirley's panicked eyes. The disruption was clearly too much for Vanessa to handle. She had been watching me from across the room, her face twisted into a mask of ugly, jealous rage. She was supposed to be the pregnant center of attention today. She was supposed to be the celebrated high society daughter-in-law that Shirley had bragged about in her hateful voice note. Instead, she was being entirely eclipsed by the woman whose husband she had stolen. Vanessa finally broke away from her group of friends and strutted across the ballroom toward me. She was holding an oversized, bright orange Hermes Birkin bag, positioning it prominently in front of her body like a shield of wealth. She stopped right in front of me, flanked by 2 of Shirley's most judgmental country club friends. She looked me up and down, her eyes filled with mocking disdain. She loudly asked how much I had paid to rent the red dress and the fake diamonds. She laughed a sharp, grating sound, telling the women next to her that poor people always loved pretending they belonged in places they could never actually afford. She patted her orange designer bag and sneered that some of us did not have to fake our luxury. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling the familiar thrill of the hunt. Vanessa had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute her public destruction. I looked at the orange leather bag and then looked directly into her eyes. I did not whisper. I spoke with the clear, projecting voice of an auditor delivering a devastating financial ruling. I told Vanessa it was a beautiful bag. I noted the specific stitching and the palladium hardware, identifying it as a limited edition piece that retailed for exactly $22,500. The 2 women standing next to her nodded in impressed agreement. Then I smiled a cold predator smile. I told her it was such a shame that she had to put it on her high-interest Platinum Rewards credit card because she did not actually have the liquid cash to afford it. Vanessa froze. The smug smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by wide-eyed panic. She stammered, trying to tell me I was crazy and demanding to know what I was talking about. I stepped closer, closing the physical distance between us so she had nowhere to hide. I listed the exact details of her financial ruin for everyone to hear. I stated that she had purchased the bag exactly 4 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon. I recited the exact interest rate of 24.9% that was currently accumulating on her completely maxed out credit card. The women surrounding us fell dead silent, their eyes darting between me and Vanessa in absolute shock. Vanessa tried to back away, her hands shaking violently, but I was relentless. I raised my voice slightly, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear every single word. I told her that the minimum payment had been missed for 3 consecutive billing cycles. I stated that her account was exactly 90 days past due and had officially been flagged for aggressive third-party collections as of yesterday morning. The humiliation was absolute. In the hyper-competitive world of high society, Atlanta, there was no sin greater than faking wealth and drowning in consumer debt. The two women standing next to Vanessa physically took a step away from her, looking at the orange bag with profound disgust. They realized she was not a wealthy elite wife. She was a desperate fraud living entirely on borrowed money she could not repay. Vanessa looked like she was going to be sick. Her face turned a mottled shade of red and white. She clutched the bag to her chest, breathing heavily, unable to form a single coherent sentence to defend herself because she knew every single digit I had just recited was a verifiable, terrifying fact. She realized in that horrifying moment that I somehow had access to her deepest, darkest financial secrets. The illusion of her superiority was shattered, completely pulverized by the cold, hard math I had just dropped on her head. She turned and practically ran toward the country club bathrooms, pushing past waiters and guests, in a desperate bid to escape the suffocating embarrassment. I watched her retreat, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, professional satisfaction. I turned back to the crowd, offering a polite, dismissive smile before walking toward the massive oak bar at the far end of the room. Standing near the mahogany counter, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, was Andre. He had dressed in a tailored navy suit, looking completely out of place among the floral dresses and teacups. He had likely only come to the event to secure funding from some of the wealthy husbands for his failing trucking division. He watched me approach, his expression a mixture of confusion and lingering arrogance. He had seen the confrontation with Vanessa, but from this distance he could not have heard the specific details of her financial execution. He leaned against the polished wood of the bar and asked what kind of sick game I was playing, showing up here in a flashy dress after he had kicked me out of my own house. I did not engage with his petty insults. The time for arguing over stolen houses and broken locks was over. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. It was unmarked, completely pristine. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany surface of the bar, sliding it directly in front of his bourbon glass. I looked at Andre, my expression entirely devoid of emotion. I told him I had brought a special gift for the proud father-to-be. Andre frowned, looking down at the white envelope. His arrogant swagger faltered for a fraction of a second. He picked up the envelope, his large fingers tracing the sealed edge. He asked me what kind of garbage I was trying to pull. I did not answer. I simply turned on my crimson heel and began walking toward the grand exit of the ballroom, leaving him standing alone at the bar. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope. I knew the exact sequence of devastating truths he was about to uncover. There were no long, complicated explanations inside. There were no emotional letters or angry accusations. There were only 3 pieces of paper printed on high-quality glossy stock. The first page contained the exact dates from Vanessa's first trimester ultrasound, matching the precise week of conception. The second page contained the detailed travelogues, proving Andre had been stationed on the offshore oil rig thousands of miles away during that exact same week. The third page was the fatal blow. It was the highly encrypted hotel receipt I had pulled from Julian's hidden corporate expense account. It showed a luxury suite booked under a shell vendor name for that precise week of conception. And clearly printed on the itemized room service bill ordered at 3 a.m. was Vanessa's favorite highly specific pregnancy craving. A bizarre combination of imported pickles and premium chocolate ice cream that she had loudly demanded in the emergency room just a few days ago. The math was flawless. The evidence was undeniable. Andre was about to realize that he was fighting a war to protect a brother who had betrayed him and a wife who was carrying another man's child. I walked out of the country club into the warm afternoon sun, knowing the explosion behind me was going to be spectacular. I did not walk straight to my car. I paused beneath the grand stucco archway of the country club entrance, standing perfectly still in the shadow of a massive stone pillar. The heavy glass double doors were slightly ajar, allowing the crisp air conditioning to spill out onto the hot patio, along with the crystal-clear acoustics of the ballroom. I wanted to hear the exact moment the Caldwell family illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It took exactly 45 seconds. The polite hum of classical music and high society chatter was suddenly violently punctured by a sound resembling a wild, wounded animal. It was a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated anguish that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. I turned slightly, looking back through the tinted glass. Andre had not just read the documents, he had absorbed them. The crisp, white papers I had left on the mahogany bar were now crushed in his massive fist. His face, normally fixed in a mask of arrogant entitlement, was contorted into a terrifying portrait of rage. The veins in his thick neck were bulging against his silk collar, and his chest heaved as he locked his eyes onto the veranda where his brother was holding court. Julian was still sitting comfortably in his medical wheelchair, the stolen money secure in his offshore accounts, perfectly oblivious to the hurricane bearing down on him. He was sipping a glass of sparkling water and smiling at the state senator's wife, completely absorbed in his own magnificent lies. Andre did not walk across the ballroom. He charged like a runaway freight train. He shoved past a table of elderly women, sending a silver tray of cucumber sandwiches and crystal teacups crashing to the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass caused the entire room to freeze. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-note. Hundreds of wealthy elite wives turned in unison, gasping in shock as the eldest Caldwell son stormed the veranda. Julian looked up just as Andre reached him. I could see the confusion register on Julian's face, quickly replaced by a patronizing annoyance. Julian opened his mouth, likely preparing to chastise his older brother for making a public scene and embarrassing their mother. He never got the chance to speak a single word. Andre did not ask for an explanation. He did not demand an apology. He simply swung his heavy arm back and delivered a devastating closed fist punch directly into the center of Julian's perfectly groomed face. The sickening crunch of bone meeting bone echoed across the silent ballroom. The sheer force of the impact snapped Julian's head back with terrifying velocity. The heavy medical wheelchair tipped backward on its wheels, balancing precariously for a fraction of a second, before violently crashing onto the hard ceramic tile of the veranda. Julian went down with it, his casted leg flying up into the air, his expensive laptop skidding across the floor and smashing into a stone planter. Total pandemonium erupted. Several women screamed, clutching their pearls and backing away in sheer terror. Security guards stationed at the perimeter began running toward the commotion, their radios squawking. Julian lay on the floor, tangled in the metal frame of his overturned wheelchair, groaning in agony as blood poured freely from his shattered nose, staining the crisp white collar of his designer shirt. Andre stood over him, breathing heavily, his knuckles scraped and bleeding. He uncrumpled the papers in his hand and threw them directly onto Julian's bleeding face. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with raw devastation. He demanded to know how Julian could sleep with his wife in his own bed while he was working offshore. He shouted the details of the hotel receipt, the specific ice cream craving, the exact dates of the ultrasound. He broadcasted their sickening betrayal to every single powerful politician and corporate executive's wife in the room. The Caldwell family's darkest, most vile secrets were suddenly public knowledge, floating in the air for all of high society to feast upon. Before Andre could reach down to grab his brother by the collar, the crowd parted violently. Shirley pushed her way onto the veranda, her face a mask of absolute horror. But the horror was not directed at the revelation of Julian's disgusting affair. It was not directed at the fact that her daughter-in-law was carrying her younger son's illicit child. The horror was entirely directed at Andre for ruining her perfect charity tea party. I watched through this glass, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer toxicity of the woman. A normal mother would have thrown herself between her sons, weeping and begging for peace. A normal mother would have demanded answers from the son who had committed the ultimate betrayal. Shirley did none of those things. She rushed straight to Julian, dropping to her knees on the hard tile, completely ignoring her ruined designer dress. She cradled Julian's bleeding head against her chest, shooting a look of pure, unfiltered hatred up at Andre. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at her eldest son and unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse so vicious it made the surrounding security guards hesitate. She screamed that Andre was a violent, unhinged animal. She told him he had always been a massive disappointment, a clumsy brute who lacked the intelligence and the refinement to truly carry the Caldwell name. Andre stared at his mother, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound heartbreak. He asked her how she could possibly defend the man who had just destroyed his marriage and fathered his wife's child. Shirley did not even flinch. She hugged Julian tighter, wiping the blood from his face with a silk napkin. She looked Andre dead in the eye and delivered the final fatal blow to his self-worth. She screamed that Vanessa had sought out Julian because Julian was a real man. She told Andre he was a pathetic failure whose trucking division was bleeding the family dry. She shouted that Julian was a corporate genius who bought her mansions, who elevated their social standing, who actually knew how to provide for a beautiful high society woman like Vanessa. She sneered that Andre should be grateful Julian was stepping up to give that unborn baby a father worth looking up to, because Andre would never amount to anything more than a glorified grease monkey in a suit. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute. The entire ballroom held its breath, watching a mother systematically dismantle her eldest son's soul to protect her favorite child's ego. Andre stood frozen, staring at the woman who had brought him into the world. The fiery rage that had fueled his attack completely drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, shattered shell of a man. He looked at the blood on his knuckles, looked at the sneering faces of his mother and his brother, and slowly backed away. He turned and stumbled through the crowd, pushing past the whispering women, his eyes vacant and dead. I had seen enough. The internal collapse of the Caldwell Empire was officially underway, and the structural damage was catastrophic. I turned my back on the glass doors and walked down the sweeping stone pathway toward the private parking lot. The Atlanta sun was intensely hot, beating down on the asphalt, but my mind was completely cold, operating with the calculated precision of a federal auditor closing out a final report. I reached my sleek black rental car and unlocked the doors with a soft chirp. As my hand gripped the door handle, I heard the heavy, frantic sound of footsteps slapping against the pavement behind me. I turned slowly, perfectly composed. Andre was marching across the parking lot toward me. His suit jacket was discarded, his tie was ripped open, and sweat was pouring down his face. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and darting frantically. The devastation I had just witnessed on the veranda had already mutated. The profound heartbreak of his mother's rejection had soured instantly, curdling into a desperate, toxic entitlement. Andre was a Caldwell, and a Caldwell never accepted responsibility for their own failures. They always found a scapegoat. He stopped a few feet away from me, blocking my path to the driver's side door. He was breathing heavily, smelling of expensive bourbon and stale sweat. He pointed a thick, bleeding finger at my face. He did not apologize for the way he had treated me when he kicked me out of my own home. He did not express an ounce of empathy or shared grief for the fact that we had both been horribly betrayed by the exact same people. Instead, he went entirely on the offensive. He blamed me. He accused me of fabricating the hotel receipts and hacking into the corporate servers illegally. He claimed I had orchestrated this entire public spectacle just to embarrass his family because I was bitter about the divorce. He stepped closer, attempting to use his massive physical size to intimidate me, looming over my pregnant frame. He lowered his voice to a menacing growl and laid out his extortion attempt. He told me my little stunt had just cost him his marriage and his standing in the family business. He said his reputation was ruined and he was going to make me pay for it. He threatened to hire the most vicious defense attorneys in the state and sue me for corporate espionage, illegal wiretapping, and malicious defamation of character. He promised he would drag my pristine independent auditing firm through the mud leak false stories to the press and personally ensure I lost my federal contracts. Then he offered me a way out. He demanded $1 million. He told me he knew I had deep pockets now that he had seen me casually drop $50,000 in the ballroom. He said if I transferred $1 million into his personal account by the end of the week, he would walk away quietly. He would sign a non-disclosure agreement, drop the lawsuit, and let me fade back into my miserable, lonely life. He crossed his arms over his chest, smirking down at me, fully believing he had successfully cornered a vulnerable target. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of high-stakes corporate blackmail. I looked at him standing in the sweltering heat, bleeding and broken, still trying to pretend he was a king. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no compassion. He was just another fraudulent entry on a corrupted balance sheet waiting to be zeroed out. I did not back away. I did not break eye contact. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my encrypted tablet. I tapped the screen, bypassing the biometric locks in a fraction of a second. I pulled up a highly secure financial portfolio dashboard and turned the screen around, holding it up so the bright afternoon sun illuminated the data perfectly for him to read. I asked Andre if he remembered a company called Apex Solutions. Andre frowned, his eyes darting to the tablet screen. The confident smirk began to slip from his face, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He blinked, staring at the numbers displayed in stark black and white. I kept my voice smooth, calm, and utterly lethal. I reminded him that his specific trucking division of the Caldwell Logistics Corporation had been failing miserably for the past 3 years. I detailed how he had taken out a massive $2 million high-interest commercial loan to cover his operational losses and fuel expenses without telling Shirley or Julian. I recited the exact dates he had defaulted on those loan payments. I explained the standard banking procedure of how his original lender had grown tired of his excuses and had bundled his toxic $2 million debt, selling it off for pennies on the dollar to a secondary corporate debt buyer, an aggressive commercial collection agency known as Apex Solutions. Andre swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his neck. He muttered that he was renegotiating the terms with Apex and that it was none of my business. He tried to puff out his chest, asserting that Apex Solutions was just some faceless corporate entity that he would eventually settle with once the market turned around. I smiled. It was the same cold predator smile I had given Vanessa right before I destroyed her fake reality. I told him he was absolutely right about Apex Solutions being a faceless corporate entity. I explained that it was a highly specialized holding company constructed behind 3 layers of anonymous blind trusts incorporated in Delaware. I told him it was specifically designed to be untraceable, shielding the true owner from any public corporate registries. I stepped forward, invading his personal space, forcing him to look away from the tablet and directly into my eyes. I dropped the final devastating hammer. I told him I owned Apex Solutions. I explained that I had established the holding company 4 years ago, utilizing my massive independent auditing bonuses. I told him I had personally authorized the purchase of his defaulted trucking debt. I owned the paper on his entire fleet of vehicles. I owned the commercial mortgage on his dispatch warehouses. I legally possessed the right to seize every single tangible asset his division held and completely liquidate his entire operational infrastructure. Andre physically recoiled as if he had been struck by lightning. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The gears in his mind were grinding together violently as the horrifying reality of his situation finally settled in. He had just tried to extort $1 million from the woman who legally owned his entire professional existence. He had threatened to sue his biggest single creditor. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a judge delivering a life sentence. I informed him that because he had threatened me with malicious litigation and attempted criminal extortion in a country club parking lot, I was no longer interested in renegotiating his payment terms. I told him that as the sole director of Apex Solutions, I was officially calling in the entire $2 million debt effective immediately. I promised him that by 9 o'clock on Monday morning, my asset seizure teams would be at his trucking yards, chaining the gates and impounding every single vehicle bearing his name. I told him his mother had been right about one thing on that veranda. He was a complete failure. And now he was a bankrupt failure holding absolutely nothing. Andre stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost difficult to witness. The last remaining pillar of his fake elite identity, his fragile masculinity tied to his failing business, was completely pulverized. His legs gave out. The sheer crushing weight of his absolute ruin forced him down. He dropped heavily onto his knees right there on the blistering hot asphalt of the private parking lot. He slumped forward, his bleeding hands pressing into the ground, his broad shoulders shaking as dry, heaving sobs ripped through his chest. He knelt at my feet, completely destroyed, stripped of his wife, his family, his business, and his pride. I looked down at him for one final moment, memorizing the pathetic image of the man who had thrown my clothes into the dirt. I turned around, opened the door of my rental car, and slid into the cool leather seat. I started the engine, the quiet hum of the motor drowning out the sound of his weeping. I engaged the transmission and drove slowly out of the parking lot, leaving the ruined remnants of the Caldwell family burning in my rearview mirror. The audit was not over yet, but the initial ledger had been successfully balanced. Now it was time to close the main account. It was time to deal with Julian. The drive back to my downtown penthouse was accompanied by the rhythmic hum of my tires against the interstate pavement. I had left Andre on his knees in the country club parking lot, a broken man who had finally realized the true cost of his blind loyalty to a toxic family. But there was no time to revel in that small victory. The main account still needed to be closed. My phone screen lit up on the passenger seat, displaying a calendar notification. It was a formal summons to the law offices of Sterling and Vance, a prestigious corporate firm in Midtown Atlanta known for handling the messy divorces and financial cover-ups of the city's elite. Julian had wasted no time initiating the next phase of his scheme. I walked into the towering glass and steel building the next morning. I wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet authority, carefully concealing the physical exhaustion of my pregnancy. When the receptionist ushered me into the sprawling mahogany-paneled conference room, the scene laid out before me was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Julian was seated at the far end of the massive table, still strapped into his medical wheelchair. He wore a neck brace and a look of practiced agony. Sitting directly beside him, clutching his uninjured hand, was Vanessa. She wore a pristine white maternity dress deliberately chosen to emphasize her delicate condition and project an aura of pure innocence. Shirley sat opposite them, wearing her signature pearls and an expression of absolute, unadulterated contempt. At the head of the table stood their attorney, Richard Sterling. He was a man in his late 50s wearing a bespoke pinstripe suit and a predatory smile. Sterling gestured to a single isolated chair on my side of the table. He did not offer me water. He did not offer condolences for my high-risk pregnancy or my recently destroyed marriage. He immediately launched into a patronizing monologue. He told me that Julian and the Caldwell family were prepared to be incredibly generous, despite my supposedly erratic and hostile behavior over the past few days. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany surface. He called it a peaceful settlement agreement. I looked down at the papers without touching them. Sterling explained the terms with the slick, practiced cadence of a seasoned con artist. He stated that Julian was willing to forego pressing federal criminal charges against me for corporate theft. He claimed that an internal audit had supposedly revealed that I had been actively embezzling funds during my time balancing the logistics company books. He told me they had fabricated digital evidence showing that I was the one funneling money from the corporate accounts to offshore holdings. He smiled, revealing slightly yellowed teeth, and said the Caldwells would quietly sweep my alleged crimes under the rug and protect me from prosecution if I simply signed the non-disclosure agreement. The catch, of course, was buried in the fine print. In exchange for my freedom, I had to accept the legal transfer of the $3 million corporate debt, which we both knew was actually $4.5 million of illicit loans into my personal name. Julian chimed in, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. He told me to just sign the papers and let it go. He said it was the only way I would stay out of a federal penitentiary. He promised he would send me a modest monthly allowance out of the goodness of his heart, so I could raise our child in a quiet, affordable neighborhood far away from their high society circles. Shirley leaned forward, sneering that I should be on my knees thanking them for their mercy instead of throwing a tantrum. She stated that they were doing me a monumental favor by not throwing a low-class thief behind bars where she belonged. Vanessa simply stroked her belly and smirked, clearly enjoying the sight of my orchestrated demise. They had painted me into a corner, and they were waiting for me to surrender. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the silver pen resting on the table. I simply checked the gold watch on my wrist. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. The air in the room shifted instantly as Roxanne walked in. Roxanne was the managing partner of the most feared corporate litigation firm in Atlanta. She was a striking heavyweight black woman who radiated absolute uncompromising power. She wore a vibrant emerald green suit that commanded the room the moment she stepped over the threshold. She did not ask for permission to enter. She marched directly to the table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome of impending doom. Roxanne dropped a massive leather briefcase onto the table right on top of Sterling's pristine settlement offer. Sterling stood up, his face flushing red, demanding to know who she was and threatening to call building security to have her removed. Roxanne ignored him completely. She snapped the brass locks of her briefcase open and pulled out her own stack of documents. She introduced herself and coldly informed Sterling that she was my lead counsel. She then proceeded to meticulously and surgically dismantle every single illusion of power the Caldwells thought they held. Roxanne pulled out the digital forensic logs I had generated from my command center. She slid a thick document toward Sterling, detailing the exact cryptographic hash and biometric timestamp of the $4.5 million loan agreement. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the page and explained that the electronic signature verifying the debt had not been executed from my personal device. It had been executed from an IP address registered to Julian's corporate smartphone. She noted that the geolocation ping placed the phone inside a downtown luxury hotel room at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. She then produced the corresponding hotel receipts proving Julian and Vanessa were occupying that exact room at that exact time, while charging the exorbitant expenses to a fake client entertainment account. Sterling's predatory smile vanished instantly. His eyes darted across the forensic logs, reading the undeniable proof of his client's forgery. But Roxanne was nowhere near finished. She pulled out the wire transfer logs detailing the intricate money laundering operation running through Shirley's church charity. She highlighted the sequential routing numbers proving the illicit loan funds were being systematically washed through the philanthropic accounts and deposited directly into Vanessa's personal offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. Roxanne looked dead into Sterling's panicked eyes. She informed him that by drafting and presenting a settlement offer based on known forged financial documents, he was actively suborning perjury and participating in federal extortion. She reminded him of his fiduciary duty as an officer of the court and the severe, irreversible penalties for corporate malfeasance. She cited specific statutes regarding wire fraud and conspiracy. She told him that if he pushed this fraudulent settlement 1 inch further, she would personally ensure he was disbarred, stripped of his assets, and indicted as a co-conspirator in a federal racketeering syndicate under the RICO Act. The color completely drained from Sterling's face. He was a high-priced divorce attorney accustomed to bullying intimidated spouses with aggressive paperwork. He was absolutely not prepared to face a federal money laundering indictment orchestrated by a forensic auditing firm. He looked at Julian and then down at the irrefutable forensic evidence laid out on the mahogany table. He realized instantly that his clients had lied to him. They had handed him radioactive forged documents and tried to use him as a pawn to execute a massive federal crime. Sterling did not say a single word of defense to the Caldwells. He frantically shoved his own paperwork into his briefcase, his hands visibly shaking. He mumbled a hasty, panicked recusal, stating he could no longer represent them in any capacity due to an extreme and immediate conflict of interest. He practically ran out of the conference room, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him, abandoning his wealthy clients entirely. The silence in the room was deafening. Shirley's jaw was practically resting on her pearls, her face a portrait of utter shock. Vanessa had shrunk back into her chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the hotel receipts, proving her affair and her financial crimes. Julian's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His expensive lawyer had just fled in terror, and his entire criminal conspiracy was sitting in plain sight, fully documented, and ready for federal prosecution. But Julian Caldwell was a narcissist to his very core, and a narcissist never surrenders, even when the ship is already at the bottom of the ocean. Julian gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning stark white. He glared at me, his voice shaking with a desperate, unhinged rage. He told me it did not matter what fake papers my loudmouth lawyer brought to the table. He spat that I had no house and no money. He sneered that my checking accounts were completely empty, and I could never afford the years of expensive corporate litigation required to actually fight him in court. He demanded to know how I planned to sue a family with endless generational wealth and deep political connections when I was a practically homeless pregnant woman. I stood up slowly, taking my time to smooth the fabric of my suit. I looked down at the pathetic man who had once promised to love and protect me. A cold, genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the massive, empty boardroom. I leaned over the table, resting my hands flat against the cool mahogany, bringing my face just inches from his. I told him I was not going to sue him. I told him a civil lawsuit was entirely too polite for what he had done to me. I smiled, looking past him to where Vanessa was trembling in her chair, clutching her stomach. I told Julian to keep his useless settlement papers and his empty threats because I had a much more important engagement to prepare for. I informed them that I would not be seeing them in a courtroom. I would be seeing them tomorrow morning because I was personally attending Vanessa's high society baby shower. The morning sun broke over the sprawling Buckhead estate, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns that used to belong to me. Julian and Vanessa had wasted absolutely no time transforming my former peaceful backyard into a grotesque monument to their stolen wealth. The baby shower was exactly the kind of tasteless, over-the-top spectacle Shirley thrived on creating. Through the tall wrought iron gates, I could see massive archways woven with thousands of pink and gold balloons, framing a newly constructed luxury pavilion that looked like a Roman temple. Wait staff in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays of mimosas and imported caviar past an enormous custom-built infinity pool that gleamed like a sapphire in the exact center of the lawn. Vanessa was draped in a flowing white silk maternity gown, sitting on a literal throne made of woven pink roses. She was accepting expensive wrapped gifts from a crowd of shallow high society wives who had absolutely no idea they were celebrating a child conceived through blatant infidelity and funded by massive federal fraud. The women laughed and clinked their crystal glasses, completely oblivious to the financial execution I had already set in motion. I did not arrive at the front gates in a luxury sedan. I did not walk up the driveway to politely ring the doorbell. I arrived flanked by two massive industrial yellow bulldozers. The heavy metal treads ground against the pristine asphalt, shaking the ground with a deep mechanical rumble that rattled the teeth in my skull. Behind the earth movers, a professional demolition crew wearing neon safety vests and heavy hard hats marched in perfect unison. The noise was deafening, completely drowning out the soft classical harp music floating from the backyard. The valet attendants panicked, scattering like frightened birds as the bulldozers rolled straight past the entrance, ignoring the driveway entirely, and driving directly over the decorative flower beds to position themselves perfectly at the edge of the property line. I stepped out of my vehicle wearing a sharp-tailored navy trench coat over my maternity wear. My posture was perfectly straight, my face an unreadable mask of absolute authority. The sheer mechanical roar of the heavy machinery had drawn the entire baby shower crowd to the edge of the lawn. 70 wealthy women stood frozen, holding their crystal glasses, staring in absolute wide-eyed horror at the industrial monsters idling just inches from the new infinity pool. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed heavily with the expensive floral perfumes wafting from the party. Shirley pushed her way to the front of the stunned crowd, her face a twisted mask of rage and disbelief. She was wearing a ridiculous, oversized pink hat that matched Vanessa's ridiculous floral throne. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, screaming over the loud rumble of the diesel engines, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. She yelled that I was a psychotic, jealous ex-wife trying to ruin a beautiful family moment because I was bitter and alone. Vanessa remained sitting on her throne, but began to cry loudly, clutching her belly and wailing about the stress I was causing her unborn baby. Julian was conspicuously absent, likely still hiding in a dark room somewhere, terrified of the legal massacre Roxanne had inflicted on him the day before. I did not shout back. I did not engage with Shirley's hysterical screaming. I simply stood my ground, waiting with my arms crossed over my chest. Within minutes, the wail of police sirens pierced the air. Shirley had a habit of calling the authorities whenever she felt slightly inconvenienced by people she deemed beneath her, and I had fully anticipated their rapid response. 3 heavily marked police cruisers swerved onto the property, their red and blue lights flashing wildly against the bright yellow paint of the bulldozers. The police chief himself stepped out of the lead vehicle, looking incredibly irritated by the chaos surrounding the elite Buckhead estate. Shirley immediately launched herself at the chief, grabbing his uniform sleeve and demanding my immediate violent arrest. She shrieked that I was a deranged trespasser attempting to destroy her multi-million-dollar property out of pure spite. She yelled that I was endangering the life of a fragile pregnant woman and begged him to put me in handcuffs and drag me to a holding cell. The chief held up his hands, urging the hysterical woman to calm down before he walked over to where I stood perfectly still beside the lead bulldozer. He looked at the heavy machinery and then at me, asking what exactly was going on here. He warned me in a stern professional voice that I was facing severe criminal trespassing and property damage charges if I did not order the machines to shut down immediately. I smiled politely at him, reaching into my heavy leather briefcase. I did not hand him a tearful excuse or try to argue with Shirley's lies. I handed him a thick stack of certified county property deeds overlaid with detailed land surveyor blueprints stamped with the official seal of the city planning office. I told the chief to look very closely at the legal property lines demarcated in red ink. I explained in a clear, carrying voice that while the main physical structure of the mansion currently belonged to Shirley, due to Julian's highly fraudulent financial maneuvers, the expansive land behind the house absolutely did not. I detailed how 3 years ago the original developer had divided the massive estate into 2 completely separate parcels for tax purposes. Julian had only ever possessed the deed to the front parcel containing the primary residence. I informed the police chief that my private holding company, BC Holdings, had quietly purchased the back 3 acres completely independent of the marital estate, and Julian had been entirely too arrogant and stupid to ever check the actual property boundaries. I pointed past the chief to the magnificent glowing infinity pool and the lavish rose-covered pavilion where Vanessa had been sitting just moments before. I stated that Shirley and Julian had arrogantly assumed the entire property was theirs to do with as they pleased. They had completely bypassed the county permitting office, avoiding the standard land surveys, and had illegally built their massive luxury additions directly on top of my privately owned commercial land. I handed the chief the final document, a fully authorized demolition permit, approved by the city zoning board, granting me the absolute undeniable legal right to clear any unpermitted illegal structures currently squatting on my private property. The police chief reviewed the documents thoroughly, his eyes scanning the certified county seals and the precise surveyor coordinates. He looked up from the papers and looked at Shirley, who was standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, looking extremely smug, fully expecting him to arrest me and drag me away. The chief shook his head slowly and handed the entire stack of legal papers back to me. He turned to his responding officers and instructed them to stand down and step back from the machinery. He then looked directly at Shirley and told her the documents were perfectly legal and verified. He stated loudly that I was entirely within my rights to clear my own land, and that she needed to clear her guests out of the demolition zone immediately. Shirley let out a sound that was half gasp, half guttural scream. She demanded he look at the papers again, claiming they must be expertly forged fakes, but the chief simply backed away, creating a clear, safe path for the heavy machinery to operate. The wealthy wives began to panic, realizing that the police were not going to stop the massive earth movers. I raised my hand, making eye contact with the demolition foreman sitting in the lead bulldozer, and gave him a single crisp nod. The foreman blew a sharp blast on his whistle, signaling the start of the operation. The bulldozers roared to full power, thick black smoke pouring from their exhaust stacks into the pristine morning air. The massive heavy metal blades dropped down, scraping against the earth, and the machines surged forward, tearing right through the pristine manicured grass. The wealthy guests shrieked in absolute terror, scattering in every direction, dropping their expensive wrapped gifts and running toward the safety of the main house patio. Caterers abandoned their carving stations and champagne towers as the lead bulldozer slammed directly into the side of the rose-covered luxury pavilion. The impact was devastating. The expensive custom woodwork splintered and snapped like fragile toothpicks, the entire structure collapsing inward in a chaotic heap of crushed flowers, shattered glass, and mangled white silk drapery. The roof caved in, destroying Vanessa's floral throne and flattening the tables, holding hundreds of tiny gourmet pastries. The second bulldozer rolled forward simultaneously, driving its massive metal treads right to the edge of the custom infinity pool. The heavy steel blades slammed into the concrete retaining wall, cracking the expensive imported tile instantly. A loud structural groan echoed across the lawn before the wall completely gave way, sending a massive tidal wave of heavily chlorinated water washing violently over the wreckage of the baby shower, soaking the remaining abandoned gifts, and turning the lawn into a muddy disaster zone. The destruction was absolute and brutally efficient. The perfect high society event was reduced to a miserable landscape of crushed wood-popped pink balloons and muddy, rushing water in less than 3 minutes. Shirley stood completely frozen in the middle of the chaos, her expensive shoes ruined by the mud, her face pale with an indescribable horror as she watched hundreds of thousands of dollars of illegal luxury construction being pulverized into the dirt right before her eyes. She could not speak, she could not scream, she could only watch her fake empire crumble. Vanessa, realizing that her perfect, luxurious day was entirely destroyed, and that the elite women she desperately wanted to impress were currently fleeing in absolute terror, resorted to the only weapon she had left in her pathetic arsenal. She dropped to her knees in the wet, muddy grass, clutching her stomach, and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She wailed that the sheer stress and noise of the bulldozers had caused something to tear inside her. She shrieked that she was having severe abdominal cramps and that I had just murdered her innocent baby with my cruel actions. She sobbed hysterically, burying her face in the mud, begging Shirley to call an ambulance, playing the ultimate desperate victim to manipulate the remaining crowd and force the police officers to intervene. The wealthy wives who had retreated to the patio gasped, clutching their chests, looking at me with pure horror, believing I had just caused a woman to lose her child. The police chief took a sudden step forward, his face etched with severe concern, reaching for his radio to call for medical dispatch. But I held up my hand to stop him, projecting an aura of complete, unbothered calm. I smiled a cold, calculating smile, looking down at Vanessa, who was rolling in the mud, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of tragic maternal agony. I did not panic. I did not back away. I simply turned toward my parked vehicle and opened the rear passenger door. I looked at the horrified crowd and told Vanessa that her health and the health of her precious baby were my absolute top priority. I explained in a loud, clear voice that I would never conduct a heavy industrial demolition near a pregnant woman without taking the utmost proper medical precautions to ensure complete safety. A woman dressed in crisp professional medical scrubs stepped out of my car carrying a sleek black leather medical bag. I raised my voice so every single remaining guest and police officer could hear me perfectly over the idling bulldozers. I introduced Dr. Elena Rostov, the chief of obstetrics at the finest elite private hospital in all of Atlanta. I told Vanessa and the gaping crowd that I had proactively paid for Dr. Rostov to accompany me today, just in case the extreme excitement of the event proved too much for Vanessa's delicate condition. Dr. Rostov walked calmly and professionally over to where Vanessa lay thrashing in the muddy grass. Vanessa froze, her screaming abruptly stopping as she stared up at the doctor in sheer panic. Dr. Rostov knelt beside her, completely ignoring the mud, and pulled out a portable medical fetal monitor. She swiftly pushed aside the wet silk of Vanessa's ruined dress and placed the device directly against her stomach. Within seconds, the steady, strong, rapid heartbeat of the baby echoed clearly from the device, filling the sudden silence of the destroyed backyard. The doctor then quickly checked Vanessa's vitals, her pulse and her physical responses, with cold, clinical efficiency. Vanessa tried to squirm away, trying to moan about phantom pain, but the doctor held her firmly in place, completing the rapid assessment. Dr. Rostov stood up, brushing the dirt from her scrubs, and addressed the police chief and the stunned crowd of elite wives. She stated in a loud, clear professional voice that Vanessa was exhibiting absolutely no signs of physical distress. She reported there was no elevated heart rate, no symptoms of cramping, and the fetal heartbeat was perfectly normal. She officially confirmed, looking directly at the police chief, that Vanessa was in perfect health and was entirely faking her medical emergency for attention. Vanessa sat up in the mud, completely exposed, her ultimate manipulation laid bare for everyone to see. The remaining elite wives stared at her in profound disgust, realizing she had weaponized her own unborn child just to play the victim and frame me. The sympathy they felt seconds ago morphed instantly into intense revulsion. Vanessa looked up at me, her face smeared with dirty water and ruined makeup, trapped in a humiliating public nightmare, from which she could never wake up. While the bulldozers revved their engines, ready to finish clearing my land, the bulldozers roared back to life, their heavy metal treads grinding forward as they completely flattened the remaining debris of the luxury pavilion. I did not stay to watch Shirley weep over her ruined grass or listen to Vanessa attempt to salvage her shattered dignity after being exposed as a fraud by a medical professional. The opening acts of my revenge were officially complete, but the grand finale was scheduled for 8:00 the following morning. I returned to my hotel room and spent the entire night finalizing my digital presentation, running diagnostic checks on the decrypted files, and ensuring every single piece of evidence was absolutely bulletproof. The Caldwell Family Logistics Corporation occupied the top 3 floors of a towering glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta, a symbol of the corporate power Julian had abused for years. The senior board of directors had called an emergency shareholder meeting to address the sudden massive hemorrhage of capital I had intentionally triggered within their internal accounts. I walked into the marble lobby wearing a razor-sharp black tailored suit, my posture radiating absolute lethal authority. I bypassed the frantic receptionist displaying my federal credentials to the security detail and rode the executive elevator straight to the top floor. Inside the massive glass-walled boardroom, Julian was already putting on the performance of a lifetime. I stood just outside the heavy oak doors, listening to his desperate lies filtering through the crack. Julian was standing at the mahogany podium, leaning heavily on his crutches, playing the role of the tragic wounded leader. His voice echoed with fake sorrow as he addressed the 50 furious shareholders and the grim-faced senior board members seated around the massive oval table. He was actively blaming the missing $4.5 million on me. He spun a ridiculous, highly emotional tale about a disgruntled former bookkeeper who had suffered a severe mental breakdown. He explicitly named me, telling the board that his bitter, estranged wife had hacked into their secure corporate servers and stolen the operational funds out of pure spite because he had bravely asked for a divorce. Shirley was sitting in the front row, wearing a somber black dress, dabbing her completely dry eyes with a silk tissue, nodding tragically to corroborate his pathetic story. Julian promised the furious investors that his high-priced lawyers were currently working alongside local authorities to seize my assets, freeze my bank accounts, and recover the stolen money before the company faced total insolvency. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with both hands, the loud thud echoing like a gunshot across the silent room. Every single head in the boardroom snapped toward the entrance. I walked in slowly, my low heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. I was not the weeping pregnant wife Julian had thrown out into the rain. I was the architect of his total annihilation. Julian stopped mid-sentence, his jaw dropping, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He gripped the edges of the podium, staring at me as if a ghost had just walked into the room. Shirley gasped, leaping out of her leather chair and screaming for building security to immediately remove the insane woman who had just terrorized her country club and destroyed her backyard. The board chairman, a ruthless elderly billionaire named Harrison, slammed his wooden gavel down, demanding to know what the hell was going on and who had authorized my presence in a highly classified corporate emergency meeting. I did not look at Shirley. I did not look at Julian. I walked directly to the center of the massive boardroom table and dropped my heavy leather briefcase right in front of the chairman. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer cold authority in my tone commanded absolute silence. I introduced myself not as Julian's desperate wife, but by my full legal and professional title. I announced that I was the lead forensic auditor formally appointed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and officially authorized by the Senior Board's Independent Oversight Committee to investigate the severe financial irregularities within the Caldwell Logistics Corporation. I pulled my titanium federal badge and my signed judicial authorization from the briefcase and slid them across the polished wood directly to the chairman. Harrison picked up the documents, his eyes widening as he read the federal seals and the heavily redacted security clearances. He looked at Julian, who was currently hyperventilating at the podium, and then looked back at me, gesturing for me to take the floor and proceed with my findings. I walked right past Julian, who was frozen in place, sweating profusely and trembling on his crutches. I plugged my encrypted laptop directly into the boardroom's master projection system. The massive digital screen spanning the entire back wall flared to life, casting a bright blue glow over the silent room. I told the board that Julian was absolutely correct about one thing. $4.5 million had indeed been stolen from the corporate accounts, threatening the very survival of the company. But the thief was not a disgruntled bookkeeper suffering from a mental breakdown. The thief was standing right next to me, desperately clinging to a mahogany podium. I clicked a button on my remote, and the screen transitioned to a highly detailed interactive financial map. I did not deal in emotional accusations. I dealt in verifiable, undeniable data. I projected the exact master loan agreement onto the wall, showing the $4.5 million illicit toxic debt secured against the company's primary operational assets. I zoomed in on the electronic signature at the bottom of the contract. I explained that Julian had forged my identity to underwrite the massive loan, completely bypassing the board's mandatory approval process and risking every single shareholder's investment. Julian stammered, his voice high and panicky, interrupting me to claim the documents were expertly faked and that I had stolen his corporate passwords to frame him. I silenced his pathetic whining with a single keystroke. I brought up the cryptographic hash and the biometric metadata attached to the digital signature block. I projected the exact IP address and the cellular geolocation ping, tracking the authorization signal directly to a downtown luxury hotel room at 2 in the morning. Then I put the final irrefutable nail in the coffin. I pulled up the time-stamped surveillance footage from that exact hotel. The high-definition video played on the massive screen showing Julian and Vanessa walking into the elevator together, laughing, while holding a bottle of champagne on the exact night and at the precise time the corporate forgery was executed. The entire boardroom gasped in unison. The shareholders began whispering furiously, their faces twisted in absolute disgust as they realized their chief logistics officer was not only a thief, but a man carrying on a sleazy affair with his own brother's wife while stealing their money. But I was not finished. I had to show them exactly where their money went and how deep the family corruption truly ran. I clicked the next slide, projecting a live trace of the $4.5 million. I walked the furious board members through the sophisticated money laundering operation second by second. The screen displayed a rapid sequence of data points. I showed them the exact fraudulent keystrokes Julian had made using his executive terminal to transfer the corporate funds into a series of dummy shell companies he had registered in Delaware. I mapped out the digital breadcrumbs showing how the dirty money was funneled out of the commercial sector and dropped directly into the primary operating account of the Buckhead Community Sanctuary charity. I then projected Shirley's personal banking records onto the massive screen, overlaying them with the charity's disbursement logs. I showed the stunned room exactly how Shirley had washed the stolen millions through her prestigious church organization, logging the illicit funds as anonymous charitable donations before quietly wiring the clean cash into an offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands. I pointed directly at Shirley, who was now shaking violently in the front row. I announced that the beloved matriarch of the Caldwell family had built her entire elite social standing on the back of massive federal tax evasion and corporate theft. Shirley let out a strangled, horrific cry, covering her face with her hands, as her pristine high society reputation was permanently vaporized in front of 50 powerful billionaires and corporate executives. The board members were actively shouting, now slamming their fists on the table, demanding answers from Julian, calling for his immediate termination, and begging the chairman to lock down the building. Julian was leaning heavily on the podium, tears streaming down his face, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He begged the chairman to listen to him, swearing that the money was still safely tucked away in the Cayman Islands and that he could wire it back to the corporate operating accounts immediately to make everything right. He frantically pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his crutch trying to log into the offshore banking portal, believing he still had his hidden safety net to bargain with. I laughed, a dark echoing sound that cut through the shouting and chaos of the boardroom. I told Julian he was going to have a very hard time transferring those funds to save his miserable skin. I clicked one final button on my laptop, projecting the current live balance of his highly encrypted Cayman Islands portfolio onto the 50-foot screen. The large, bold numbers glowed bright red for the entire room to see. $0.00. I explained to the screaming boardroom that I had already bypassed his pathetic consumer-level banking firewalls the night before. I showed them the irrevocable forced wire transfer logs, proving that every single penny of the washed $4.5 million had been completely drained from his hidden vault. I revealed that the stolen wealth had been dropped squarely into Vanessa's personal offshore account and subsequently flagged by a silent Internal Revenue Service script, ensuring that any attempt to move the money would trigger an immediate federal asset freeze. Julian's eyes rolled back in his head. The realization that the woman he had betrayed held absolute legal control over his stolen fortune completely broke his mind. The math was inescapable, and his digital execution was flawless. He let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his remaining crutch slipping on the polished hardwood floor. He collapsed into a heap behind the mahogany podium, sobbing uncontrollably as the angry shareholders swarmed around him demanding their money and his immediate resignation. The chairman was furiously dialing the police, but I had already handled that specific detail as well. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom flew open once again, and 6 federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical vests marched into the room, holding up federal arrest warrants for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. The 6 federal agents fanned out across the plush carpeting, their presence instantly dropping the temperature in the massive boardroom to freezing. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with steel gray hair and a completely humorless expression, stepped directly toward the front of the room. He held up a thick stack of manila folders sealed with the official crest of the Department of Justice. The billionaire shareholders who just moments ago had been shouting in a furious uproar now sat in absolute terrified silence. Nobody dared to breathe. Julian backed away from the mahogany podium, his fake medical injuries completely forgotten. He stood perfectly upright without his aluminum crutches, his eyes darting frantically between the federal agents and the massive digital screen that still displayed the undeniable proof of his offshore money laundering. Julian was a cornered rat, and a cornered rat will always lash out at whoever is closest. His face twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate rage, and he thrust a shaking finger directly at me. He screamed that it was all a lie. His voice echoed sharply off the glass walls, pitching upward into a hysterical shriek as he pointed at the forensic auditing data on the screen. He screamed that I was a psychotic ex-wife who had hacked into the corporate mainframe to frame him. "It is her!" he yelled, spit flying from his lips. "She hacked the code. The money is not with me. I do not have it. She stole it to ruin my life." He begged the federal agents to arrest me, insisting that I was the mastermind who had fabricated the entire digital trail. The lead FBI agent did not even blink at Julian's pathetic outburst. He simply checked the notes on his clipboard and looked toward the back of the boardroom. Vanessa was sitting in the corner next to a completely catatonic Shirley, trying desperately to shrink down into the oversized leather upholstery. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf, attempting to hide her face after the humiliating public destruction of her baby shower the day before. Right on cue. Breaking the heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom, a sharp, crisp electronic chime echoed from Vanessa's expensive designer handbag. It was the distinct, highly recognizable notification sound of an elite international banking application. Vanessa froze, her entire body going rigid as every single eye in the room suddenly turned to look at her. The lead agent walked slowly down the length of the oval table, stopping directly in front of her chair. He held out his hand, palm up, and ordered her to produce the cellular device. Vanessa trembled uncontrollably, her perfectly manicured fingers shaking so badly she could barely open the gold clasp of her purse. She pulled out her phone, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light of the boardroom. She looked down at the notification and let out a sound that was half gasp, half choked sob. The agent snatched the phone from her trembling hands and held it up, reading the screen aloud for the entire board of directors to hear. It was an automated security alert from a private wealth management firm in the Cayman Islands, confirming the successful secure deposit of exactly $4.5 million directly into a personal account registered exclusively under Vanessa's name. The digital breadcrumbs had fully materialized into physical, undeniable reality right in the palm of her hand. The collective gasp from the 50 shareholders sounded like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room. The chairman of the board, Harrison, turned his furious glare toward Julian. His face flushed purple with unadulterated corporate rage. The lead agent handed the phone to a subordinate to be bagged as federal evidence before turning back to Julian and Vanessa. He cleared his throat and officially read the federal arrest warrants aloud. The charges hung heavy in the air, echoing with the promise of decades in a federal penitentiary. Embezzlement, grand larceny, conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, federal wire fraud, and massive international tax evasion. The moment the word tax evasion left the agent's lips, Vanessa completely broke. The pristine high society illusion she had spent months carefully crafting shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She fell to her knees right there on the expensive boardroom carpet, sobbing hysterically, her tears mixing with her heavy contour makeup, leaving thick dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. She clutched at the federal agent's pant legs, screaming that she was completely innocent. She wailed that she was just a pregnant woman who did not understand anything about offshore banking or corporate finance. She pointed a shaking finger at Julian and shrieked that he had forced her to do it. She screamed that Julian had set up the accounts in her name without her permission, and that he had manipulated her into taking the fall for his massive criminal enterprise. She threw him under the bus with a vicious, desperate speed that left the entire boardroom stunned. Julian's narcissistic ego, already fractured by the destruction of his career, finally snapped completely under the weight of her betrayal. The mask of the charming, smooth-talking executive violently peeled away, revealing the vile, toxic man hiding underneath. He lunged forward, his face contorted with absolute hatred, screaming curses at the woman he had destroyed my marriage for. He called her a lying, gold-digging tramp right in front of the horrified billionaires. He yelled that she had been begging him for expensive jewelry and luxury vacations, demanding that he find a way to fund her extravagant lifestyle because his brother's pathetic salary was not enough to satisfy her endless greed. He screamed that she was a parasite who had ruined his life and that she was going to rot in a federal cell right alongside him. The sheer venom and hatred spewing between the two lovers was a grotesque spectacle. They were viciously tearing each other apart like wild animals caught in a trap, screaming terrible, undeniable truths about their illicit affair and their shared criminal conspiracy. The board members watched in stunned, disgusted silence. These were the people Julian had trusted, the powerful elite circle he had so desperately wanted to impress, and they were now looking at him as if he were a diseased insect. Shirley was still sitting in the front row, her jaw hanging open, her expensive pearl necklace clutched tightly in her trembling fist. Her entire world, her carefully curated legacy, her pristine social standing, was currently being broadcast as a trashy criminal soap opera in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. The son she had idolized, the son she had helped steal my marital home, the son she had protected at my expense, was currently screaming vile obscenities at his pregnant mistress, while federal agents read him his Miranda rights. Shirley's eyes rolled back slightly, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the sheer, overwhelming humiliation of the moment finally broke her mind. She simply slumped forward in her chair, staring blankly at the floor, completely unresponsive to the chaos exploding around her. The federal agents moved in swiftly, having zero patience for the domestic meltdown occurring in the middle of a corporate crime scene. Two agents grabbed Julian's arms, twisting them roughly behind his back. Julian yelped in pain, struggling instinctively against the hold, but the agents were merciless. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed loudly in the room. They shoved him forward, stripping him of his expensive tailored suit jacket and reading him the remainder of his rights as they marched him toward the heavy oak doors. Julian looked over his shoulder, making direct eye contact with me one last time. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of absolute panic and profound, terrifying realization. He finally understood that I had not just beaten him, I had completely erased him from existence. I simply tilted my head, checking the gold watch on my wrist, offering him absolutely no emotion, no sympathy, and no forgiveness. Vanessa was still sobbing on the floor, clutching her stomach and begging for mercy. A female federal agent pulled her roughly to her feet, snapping a second pair of handcuffs around her wrists. Vanessa wailed, screaming for Shirley to help her, begging for someone to call her a lawyer. But Shirley remained catatonic, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. The agents marched Vanessa out right behind Julian, her expensive silk scarf trailing pathetically on the floor behind her. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving a profound ringing silence in their wake. I stood perfectly still at the center of the boardroom, allowing the deafening quiet to settle over the furious billionaires. The digital screen behind me still glowed with the irrefutable data mapping out the salvaged corporate funds. Chairman Harrison was the first to break the silence. He slowly lowered himself into his high-backed leather chair, running a trembling hand over his face. He looked at the empty space where his chief logistics officer had stood just moments before, and then he looked directly at me. The hostility and suspicion that had previously clouded his expression were completely gone, replaced by a stark, desperate respect. He cleared his throat, acknowledging the undeniable reality that without my quiet, relentless forensic investigation, the entire Caldwell Logistics Corporation would have filed for federal bankruptcy by the end of the fiscal quarter. The shareholders murmured in agreement, their earlier panic replaced by a grim realization of how close they had come to total financial ruin. Harrison addressed me formally using my proper title, thanking me for my exceptional service to the board, and asking what the next steps were to fully recover the frozen assets from the Cayman Islands. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom slammed shut behind the federal agents as they dragged Julian and Vanessa out into the corridor, and the deafening silence that followed was heavy enough to crush solid bone. The 50 billionaires and senior corporate executives seated around the massive oval table were completely paralyzed, unable to process the absolute violent destruction of their chief logistics officer that had just played out right in front of them. The digital projection screen behind the mahogany podium still glowed bright blue, displaying the undeniable forensic proof of the massive embezzlement and offshore money laundering. I stood perfectly still at the center of the room, calmly shutting down my encrypted laptop and sliding the machine into my heavy leather briefcase. The job was officially done. The financial execution was flawless. My stolen assets were completely secured, and the toxic people who had tried to destroy me were currently being loaded into federal transport vehicles. I was preparing to address the shocked chairman one final time when a sudden, desperate movement broke the heavy stillness of the room. Shirley, who had been sitting in the front row in a catatonic state of shock, suddenly snapped back to a horrifying reality. The polished high society matriarch, who had spent her entire privileged life looking down her surgically enhanced nose at everyone she deemed beneath her, completely shattered. She scrambled out of her expensive leather chair, her designer black dress twisting awkwardly around her knees. She did not walk toward me to demand answers or throw insults. She practically crawled. She threw herself onto the plush corporate carpet right in the middle of the silent boardroom and lunged forward, wrapping her trembling arms tightly around my legs. The elite executives gasped in unison, watching the proud, untouchable Shirley Caldwell reduce herself to a groveling, weeping mess. She buried her face against my knees, sobbing with a pathetic, raw desperation that echoed loudly off the glass walls. She begged me, her voice hoarse and broken, pleading for me to stop the federal investigation and call off the forensic audit. She wailed that Julian was her only son, that he was all she had left in the world, and that a long federal prison sentence would destroy him completely. Her elitist pride was entirely gone, stripped away, and replaced by the terrified, frantic panic of a woman watching her legacy turn to ash in real time. She looked up at me. Her expensive makeup ruined her signature pearls, hanging sideways, promising me absolutely anything I wanted. She swore she would give me her entire private pension, her hidden assets, her jewelry, whatever it took, if I would just hack back into the system and save her precious boy from a federal indictment. I did not move to help her up from the floor. I did not offer her a single ounce of the sympathy or grace she had so routinely denied me throughout my marriage. I slowly took a deliberate half-step backward, forcing her to release her desperate, clawing grip on my legs. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing the fabric of my tailored navy coat and gently resting my hand over the swell of my pregnant belly. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman on the floor, my expression a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. I asked her in a quiet, lethal voice that carried to every corner of the silent boardroom if she remembered the exact words she had spoken to me in the emergency room on the night I nearly lost my child. I watched her eyes widen in fear as the memory clearly hit her. I reminded her that she had stood over my hospital bed while I was bleeding and vulnerable, and arrogantly declared that the prestigious Caldwell family had bestowed a monumental honor upon a ghetto orphan by allowing me into their elite circle. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single silent board member in the room heard exactly what kind of monster they had been associating with all these years. I leaned down slightly, keeping my voice steady and cold. I told Shirley that the mighty, prestigious Caldwell name she was so incredibly proud of was nothing but a fragile, rotten illusion built on a foundation of incompetence. I revealed to her and the listening executives that the only reason her family had survived the last 5 years without going completely bankrupt was because I had been secretly working late into the night patching up Julian's disastrous failing financial reports. I explained how her brilliant son lacked even a basic understanding of corporate logistics, and how I had spent years covering his monumental blunders, balancing the ledgers, and preventing massive corporate audits from exposing his sheer stupidity. I told her that I was the silent architect, keeping their fake empire afloat while they treated me like disposable trash. I looked her dead in the eyes and stated that today I was not acting out of jealousy or spite or malice. I told her I was simply a highly skilled auditor collecting my long overdue return on investment. Shirley stared up at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, trying to process the reality that the woman she had called an uneducated orphan was the only reason she had ever tasted true luxury. She opened her mouth to offer her pension again, weeping and begging me to take her retirement funds to make the federal charges disappear and give her life back. I smiled a thin, merciless smile and delivered the final crushing blow to her shattered reality. I told her she had absolutely nothing left to offer me. I informed her that at precisely 7 o'clock this morning, my legal team had filed the highly encrypted trace logs of her church charity money laundering directly with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I watched the last remaining spark of hope completely die in her eyes as I explained the brutal reality of her situation. The federal government had already frozen every single one of her personal bank accounts, her hidden offshore assets, and her entire private pension to aggressively restitute the furious shareholders sitting in the room with us. I leaned in close, delivering the final, undeniable truth. I told her she was completely bankrupt and totally alone. I reminded her that she did not even have her stolen Buckhead mansion to return to hide her shame, because my demolition crew had just finished turning her illegal luxury pavilion and her pristine backyard into a pile of splinters and deep mud. Shirley let out a hollow, broken gasp that sounded like all the air leaving her lungs. She collapsed fully against the boardroom floor, weeping uncontrollably into the carpet as the absolute totality of her ruin finally crushed her. She had absolutely nothing left in the world. No money, no mansion, no pristine social standing, no country club memberships, and no son. She was completely destroyed by her own arrogant, boundless greed. I stepped around her weeping form without a second glance, picking up my heavy leather briefcase. I did not look back as I walked out of the massive oak doors, leaving the shattered, miserable remains of the Caldwell dynasty on the floor for the federal agents to sweep up. I stepped into the executive elevator, the doors sliding shut, silently, sealing away the trauma and the betrayal of the past, forever. The ride down to the lobby felt incredibly weightless. The air outside the skyscraper felt crisp and clean, washing over my face as I stepped out into the bustling city. I gently rubbed my stomach, feeling a powerful kick from my unborn child. We were safe, we were secure, and the future was entirely ours. It was a perfect day to start building a real empire. The most profound lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. When toxic family members constantly underestimate your potential and treat you as an outcast, the greatest revenge is not anger, but silent, relentless success. True power lies in building your own financial independence and walking away from conditional love. You never need to shrink yourself to fit into environments that refuse to appreciate your light. Ultimately, the beautiful life you build for yourself is far more valuable than the toxic blood ties you must leave permanently behind. Share your own story in the comments below if you have ever found the courage to walk away from a toxic environment and build your own success.